In this video, we will continue creating two endpoints: GetGameState that will return the game state, and StartRound that will start a new round. To implement the endpoints, we will create two new data types. We are now going to create two data types that will be used as DTOs. The StartRound function will receive a parameter with the game ID that will return the game state. The returned object will contain useful information for the frontend to show the player, and amongst that information we can find the quiz of the current round. Since the quiz data type is already generated by the wizard and has more information that we want to present to the player, such as the correct answer, to avoid this problem, we will create a new data type called round quiz that will contain pieces of the quiz data type, such as the questions and possible answers, and the round ID for the quiz. So we go create round quiz, round quiz will be an object. It will contain the round ID played, the quiz question, and the 4 available options. Now we will create the game status and we will call it game state. So create game state and add the information for status. The game ID, topic name, player name, current score, round number, total number of rounds, a boolean that indicates if the game is over, the current quiz, and it's going to be of the round quiz type. With this last one, we have all the data types needed to continue creating the endpoints. We are now ready to start implementing the GameState endpoint. This function will receive the game ID and will return the game state object. Now to configure the routing, we click on configure. On path we will have /GameState/game ID in between curly braces. This method verb will be post. And in here, we will set up the parameters mapping to the URL. The name in between curly braces, game ID, will be a parameter that we can bind to the function's parameter. Now to configure this binding between the URL string and the function parameter, we click on Add, select the parameter that was in curly braces, game ID. This parameter is going to be found on the URL path and binds to our parameter called game ID of the function. We click on OK and we step over to start implementing the functions body. The first thing we are going to do is to create a couple of variables that we are going to use in the function. We have a game of type game, GameState of type GameState, on the actual body we are going to get the game from the game ID and check in case we have a null value. If that happens, we are going to throw an exception. Now we start to fill up the information of our game state variable using the previously defined helpers. Now let's find the topic name using getTopic by GameID helper we just created. The player name, we get this from the game. And now the flag to see if the game is over, checking for the game end time to not be null. If this field is not null, the game has already finished. We have the score, and for the current round, we check the get rounds played helper. Since this function returns rounds that are over, we have to add 1 to indicate that this is indeed a new round. And finally, the total number of rounds, and we get this from the one wrapper function get total rounds per game that pulls from the config parameter we did a couple of videos ago. The next step will be to fill up the current quiz being played in the round. We create a variable to store it, current quiz of type round quest. And we initialize the variable as null. To fill up this current quiz, we check for the current round to be less than the total number of rounds. So that we can extract the last round associated with the game. If the round is not null, it means it is still ongoing. So we fill up the information of the current quest. This is possible through the transformation we previously built that adds extra information. That's why we not only have the round information, but the rounds quiz as well. And also we get access to the question and possible answers. We use some copy pasting to accelerate the process. And to wrap things up, we assign the current quiz. We filled to the game state. And now we need to return it. With this return, we finish up the implementation of the endpoint. Now let's test the endpoint's functionality, but before we need to correct an error in the routing definition, since the verb needs to be get and not post, and this is due to we are not going to be doing any update or insertion, and that's best used for those use cases. Once we solve this routing error, we are going to proceed to run the solution and do a couple of tests. First, let's do a game state request for a non-existing game, since we haven't created any game yet. We can see that it's returning a 404 not found error, and in the body we can see the response can't find the game. Now let's create a game using the endpoint we created, passing a player name and a topic ID. This will create the game with ID number 1. Now let's list all the quizzes with the topic equals to 1. We can see all the quizzes for this topic. We should actually see 50 from the 101 to 150. Now let's simulate the start round endpoint, which we have not implemented yet. This will add a new round with a random quiz. So we insert a round with the game ID number 1 and a random quiz, which we manually selected the 101 and a start date time. Now that we created a round and we simulated the functionality of the start round endpoint, we are going to test the game state, and we are going to do a petition over the game state, passing the game ID number 1. We can see that we have all the related information: the game ID, topic ID, player name, the flag that says that the game is not over, score equals to 0, and the current round, which is the first out of 5, and finally the current quiz with the questions and answers. We can now be confident that the endpoint is working correctly. Now let's create the start round endpoint. That from the game ID will return the full game state. We configure the routing the same way we did on the last one. And now we implement the business logic of the function. The first thing to do is to obtain the current game state. And to check if we need to create a new round. That condition comes from checking if the current round number is less than the total number of rounds, and that no other current round is created. The last part comes from checking if the current quiz is null. So we are going to create a Boolean variable that solves this logic, named has to create new round. If we need to create a new round, we are going to get a new random quiz and insert the new register in the rounds table with setQuiz, updating the state with the information of the quiz. That random quiz that has not been played before is going to be obtained from our helper getRandomQuiz. We check for null, and throw an error in case we cannot find a new random quest. Once we are at this point, we just need to fill the new round we are creating. To store the data, we are going to create another variable called new round of type round. And we fill with the information. Game ID, the quiz ID from the random quiz, we use the now function as the date time, and we call the function create round, passing the new round object. And this function will insert the register and return the round ID integer. So we store it in the round ID created number variable. Finally, we will complete the game state with the current quiz and the associated round ID number. Returning the game state. That finishes the StartRound endpoint implementation. Once we are done with the endpoint implementation, we will be doing some quick tests. So we run the solution and we start off by creating a new game with the following information. Once we create the game, we start a new round. We can see here that we have created a new round with the ID number 1 with the associated questions and answers. To see the stored information, say for the round, we get the round with the created ID of 1. And from this request, we can see that the game associated with the 1 and the quiz selected was the 139. We can also see a start date and time for the current round. Now let's simulate that we finalize the round, and for that we will copy this information and update the finish date, selecting the correct answer. We make the update through the round endpoint with the round ID of 1. It returns a 1, which is the, again, round ID, So now we will start a new round for the game ID number 1. We can see that we get a different quiz. The round ID is now with a number 2, and the current round number is 2 as well. If we get the information of the round using this round ID number 2, we can see that it's still ongoing, and if we get the first round, we can see the updated information. These tests should be enough to ensure they work as intended.